Hey everyone, it is 10:05 Vietnam time, and I would like to start the event right away. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to today's online webinar, where we will explore the topic of community as socialist value. I am your host, and I'm delighted to have you all here today. So first of all, I will begin with a brief outline of the webinar. We will start with Dr. Spafford's speech in English. And since this event is not very well attended, I think Dr. Spafford will spend probably around 40 or 50 minutes on his presentation, and there will not be a translation of the speech into Vietnamese. And during or after the period when Dr. Spafford made his speech, you can ask questions in the Q&A box or the chat box. And the answers to these questions will be provided in English, and the summaries of the answers alongside the entire speech will be posted on our site on around Wednesday or Thursday. Before we begin, we would like to request all participants to turn off their microphone throughout the session. If you have any questions, please type them out in the chat box or the Q&A box. Anyone who intends to disrupt the meeting will be kicked out of the room and will not be let back in. Okay, so now let me introduce our speaker for today's webinar, Jesse Spafford. Dr. Spafford earned his PhD from the esteemed Graduate Center of City University of New York, after which he became a research fellow in Trinity University in Ireland. He is currently a lecturer in philosophy at Victoria University of Wellington, New Zealand. Dr. Spafford is also the author of Social Anarchism and the Rejection of Moral Tyranny, recently published by Cambridge University Press. He also contributed a chapter in the collection, The Routledge Handbook of Anarchy and Anarchist Thought, and his articles have appeared in prestigious journals such as Res Publica and Journal of Applied Philosophy. And we are honored to have Dr. Spafford with us here today, and we eagerly anticipate the ideas he will share. And the floor is yours, Spafford. And please, Jesse, I would like to remind you that we will not be translating the speech into Vietnamese because we only have around 3 or 4 viewers today. So you are free to extend your speech and extend your Q&A session however you want. Yes, thank you. The floor is yours.
Great, thank you so much. Let me just share my screen here. Okay, great. So first of all, thank you for those of you who are attending. Thank you so much for the invitation to present to you all. I think this paper will hopefully be of interest. And so I'll just run through my argument, talk a little bit about community, what community means to socialists or should mean to socialists. And then I look forward to answering your questions. So to get started, for a bit of context, when people talk about community, they might use this word in many ways, right? People might use the term community just to refer to a group of people who happen to be living in a particular area. Or alternatively, they might use it to refer to a group of people who share something important in common. So for example, you might refer to the Muslim community or the queer community, right? Those are not just groups of people living together, but groups of people who all have a shared culture or a shared interest or a shared tendency or something along those lines. But I'm interested in community in a different sense. Specifically, I'm interested in community as it's been used by philosophers, and particularly socialist philosophers, when trying to make the moral case for socialism. So the idea here is that when socialist philosophers talk about community, what they have in mind is that community is a relationship that can obtain between different people, right? So between you and I, we might live next door to each other, we might have many things in common, but there still might not be community between us if we don't have the right sort of relationship, if we don't stand in the right kind of social relation to one another. So the idea is that, yeah, community is a relationship between people, and it's a morally important one. So the thought is that there's something valuable about community, such that if community is lost, then something's gone wrong. Then the society without community is in some way defective, in some way bad, and would be better if there were more community between people. So that's the sense of community in which I'm interested. Additionally, the idea is that community in this sense is considered to be an important reason for favoring socialism over alternative economic systems like capitalism. So the idea is that in capitalist societies, something about the nature of capitalism, the nature of market society, is such that it undermines community between people. And this is a reason to dislike capitalism, a reason to favor socialism, because the thought is that a socialist economy is one where there would be more community. Okay, so that's the big picture. But this then raises the question, well, what exactly is community? What does it mean to say that people have more or less community between them? And that's the question that I try to answer in the paper that I'm going to be presenting today. So I'm going to give an answer to this question, but before I do, I want to talk a little bit about the method. So there's a question of, well, what are we trying to even do when we give an account of community, when we try to describe what community is? And I want to say that any answer to the question of what is community is going to have to answer two different questions. The first is what I call the community question. So the idea here is, what is lost when community is undermined? That's a question that any account of community is going to have to answer. And there's going to be three subparts to this question. So the first is just, what is community? So if you're giving an account of community, the thought is that you need to give a definition of community. You just have to say, well, what is it in the first place? Second, I think you need to say something about the signs of community. What are the signs when community is lost? What are the symptoms of a loss of community? Because sometimes a loss of community might be directly observable, but sometimes it might not be. Sometimes you might recognize the community has been lost indirectly because there's something that you see or perceive or experience that indicates the community is lost. So I think that if that's the case, a theory of community needs to be able to explain what it is that's lost. Or it has to be able to explain what these signs are of community being lost. Okay, and then finally, an account of community needs to give some explanation of why community is valuable. Because the idea here, right, is that a loss of community is supposed to be something that's bad about capitalism. The fact that capitalism undermines community is a reason not to like capitalism. But that's only going to be the case, right? If there's something morally valuable about community, if community is lost and everybody says, well, so what? Who cares? Then it seems like you haven't actually given a very good argument for socialism. To make a good argument for socialism, you have to say, oh, capitalism undermines community, socialism doesn't, and community is morally important. So I think that a good socialist account of community needs to answer all three of these subparts of this question. Okay, additionally, an account of community needs to answer what I call the mechanism question. And the idea here is you have to say, well, why is it that markets undermine community? Again, if you want to use community as part of an argument against capitalism, you have to explain why it is that capitalism undermines community. So you say, here's what community is, here's why it's valuable, and here's why capitalism undermines it. Okay, so that's what a good account of community should do. Additionally, a good account of community, I think, should be able to make sense of various intuitive cases where community is lost between people. So in the paper, what I try to do is I present a few different cases where I think, at least intuitively, pre-theoretically, before you even consider any kind of theory of community, it just seems like these are cases where something has gone wrong socially between people. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to present these cases, and then later on, we can talk about what different accounts of community have to say about them. Okay, so here's the first case. This one comes from a little book by the socialist philosopher G.A. Cohen. He's got a book called Why Not Socialism? And in that book, one of the arguments he makes is he says socialism is preferable to capitalism because it's better with respect to community. And he tries to illustrate that by presenting this case. He says, here's a case of something that happens all the time under capitalism, or at least things like this happen all the time under capitalism. And it seems like something has gone wrong. So the idea is you've got some people, they're riding a crowded bus in the morning, and he describes it this way. He says, "I am rich and I live an easy life, whereas you are poor. You have to ride the crowded bus every day, whereas I pass by you in my comfortable car. One day, however, I must take the bus because my wife needs the car. I can reasonably complain about that to a fellow car driver, but not to you. I can't say to you, it's awful that I have to take the bus today. There's a lack of community between us of just the sort that naturally obtains between me and the fellow car driver." Okay, so this is his case. Yeah, and the thought is that something has gone wrong here on the bus. You've got these people, they're together. Under different circumstances, they would be able to have this nice conversation, but they can't. There's some sort of inhibition that's interfering with our natural relationships with each other. So something's gone wrong here. Exactly what's gone wrong, we'll talk about a little bit later. Okay, so that's one case. Another case is what I call the fine-tuning case. And this one's drawn from an American television show called New Girl that I guess I was watching at the time when I wrote the paper. And this case centers around these two friends, Winston on the left and Nick on the right. And the context is that the two of them have been playing poker, and Nick on the right has lost a significant amount of money to Winston, specifically $200. So he now owes Winston $200 that he's promised him. So when Nick goes to Winston to settle his debts, but before he pays him, he says the following. He says, "Okay, well, I did pay for gas here though. So that's, let's say, $10. So we're at $190. Let's say a clean $190. Oh, and I hate to be this guy, but I got the fights on Friday." Fights referring to boxing tickets. So let's call it, so that's $30. So let's call it $160 and be done with it. Oh, and $20 for beer that night. So $160 takes us to $140, just to be fair, right? So he's trying to sort of grind down his debt, reduce his debt by calling in all these previous debts that Winston owes him. But then, of course, Winston counters and says, "Well, I have a few accounts that I'd like to settle. Account number 1, a $15 receipt for a Chinatown box turtle. Bam, there we go." Which Nick replies, "We're doing this, huh?" And Winston says, "Yeah, we are doing this. Item number 2, a canceled $35 check for registration of a domain name." Nick says, "I have to go to work at a bar where you drink for free. How much does 400 cognac and colas add up to, Winston?" Which Winston replies, "You want to go there? How about all the times I sat around listening to you moan about how Caroline broke your precious little heart?" Okay, so, this is maybe a very American example, but I imagine that there's something universal about this, that many people have had experiences along these lines where once the subject of debts is brought up between people, things can get a little bit fraught. And so in here we have two friends who, get into this very tense argument, something that seems to maybe even threaten their friendship because the subject of past debts is brought up. So it seems to me pretty clear this is a case of damaged community. Okay? And then there's a third case that I call the no politics at the dinner table case. Again, maybe this is a very American example, I'm not sure, but another one that I would suspect is universal. And this is, at least in the case in America, there are many families where they have a rule where they say, when we're all gathered together for dinner, especially for big extended family dinners, when there's say a national holiday and people come together and you've got a big group of extended family having dinner together, there's a rule where people say, you're not allowed to talk about politics. Nobody should bring it up. Why? Because when people start talking about politics, people get very angry and some people start to yell at each other and it can just ruin the whole dinner, and then people don't talk to each other for months afterward. And so people try to just prevent any of that from happening by making this rule. But again, I want to say it seems like something's gone wrong here. You have another case where it seems like there's a bit of social tension that might, in a sort of a better world, would not exist. Okay, so there are these three cases, and I want to say that any good account of community should be able to accommodate these cases. It should make sense of them. It should explain what it is that they all have in common, and you should be able to see why it is that the account of community can make sense of these cases, right? So the thought is you give an account, you say, here's what community is, and here's why this account explains these cases. Here, this account can help us make sense of what's gone wrong in each of these cases. Okay, so that's what I try to do in this paper when I give my account of community. Before I give my account of community, though, I want to present a rival view, an alternative interpretation to consider that I actually think doesn't do such a good job of answering the community and mechanism questions or accommodating these cases. So I'll present that, and then I'll present my version and explain why I think my version does a better job. Okay, so here's the account. I call it the common ground account. It's been put forward typically by people trying to interpret what it was that G.A. Cohen was arguing when he was talking about the commuter case, the case featuring the bus rider and the car driver. And on this account, the idea is that a lack of community between people consists in their inability to relate to one another due to their lack of shared experiences. Okay, so here's the idea. When you consider the bus case, in that case, the complaint was that it seems like there's this inhibition, there's this tension between these people, where the person who normally drives their car to work isn't able to really talk to the person who normally takes the bus. It seems like there's an inability for them to relate to one another. And among those who interpret community in this way, they say, well, here's what's gone wrong in this case. In this case, the rich person has a very different set of experiences from the person who isn't rich, who normally rides the bus. Right? The rich person, they live in their nice house, they drive their fancy car, they're just living in a different social world from the person who maybe lives in a small apartment with roommates and has to ride public transportation everywhere. And as a result, they live such different lives that they actually become alien to one another. They're not able to understand each other, they can't empathize, with the thought being that often social bonds are formed because people have shared experiences. When you go to school together, when you work together, you have this set of shared experiences that you can talk about, that you have this whole body of experience that you can draw upon to connect to one another, to commiserate about, to sympathize with one another about. But if you just start living such different lives, then you can't do that anymore. And that seems to be, on this view, what's gone wrong on the bus. The car driver, they live in different worlds. They can't relate to one another. So that's the statement of it informally, but let's be a little bit more precise and talk about how this account answers the various questions that I presented before. So how does it answer the community question and the mechanism question? Okay, well, with respect to the community question, the first thing it does is it gives an answer to the question of what is community? And it answers it in this way. It says there's a greater community between two people to the extent that they are able to empathize with and thereby relate to one another. Right? So that's just what community is. It's an ability to sympathize, to understand people's experiences because you've had those same experiences. And when you don't have those same experiences, you aren't able to sympathize, you can't understand where they're coming from, and as a result, you're not able to relate to them. You aren't able to have sympathetic exchanges. You can't say, oh, I've been there, I know what it's like, that's terrible. Instead, you say, oh, it's never happened to me. Okay. The second community question was, well, what are the visible signs? What are the symptoms of a loss of community? And this account answers this question by saying the symptom of a lack of community is socially awkward exchanges. So what happens when community is lost between people? Well, they're just left with nothing to talk about, right? We're riding the bus together and I'm thinking, oh, what can I say to this person? Can I talk about how tough it is to ride the bus? Well, no, that's awkward. Can't do that. You wouldn't really, you can't really appreciate what it's like to drive my car. I don't know what to say. So we just stand there awkwardly. Okay, so that's how this proponents of this account answer the second subpart of the community question. And then finally, there's the question of, well, what is it that's morally valuable about community on this account? And the thought is that there's something morally valuable about empathetic social interactions. So the thought is that there's something morally good when we can sympathize, when something bad happens to you and I can say, oh, I'm so sorry, that's terrible, I can totally relate. The thought is when we can do that, that bonds us together as people. It makes our social lives richer in some way, such that it's bad when that's undermined and we can't sympathize with each other in that way. Okay, so that's how the common ground account answers the community question. What about the mechanism question? Why is it that markets and capitalism undermine community on this account? Well, the answer that hopefully is now fairly clear is that market exchange has this effect because it generates inequality. And inequality causes us to have very different social experiences. So in the commuter's case, the thought is, why can't we relate to one another? Because I'm rich and you're poor. And so as a result, we live very different lives. I drive my car, you ride the bus, we have nothing in common. And that's a result of capitalist inequality. By contrast, in a socialist society, things would be much more equal. And so we would have much more similar lives, and we'd have much more in common and be able to then relate to one another and have these sympathetic exchanges. Okay, so that's the common ground account. Now, I think there's some superficial plausibility here, but there are also some very serious problems with this account. So let's talk about why I think this account doesn't work. The first problem is that when it comes to shared experiences, inequality and equality actually don't seem to matter that much, right? So suppose that I'm very rich and you aren't, and then the thought is, to what extent do we have similar experiences? To what extent do we have common ground? Well, it turns out we might have quite a bit of common ground and shared experience still, even despite our wealth differences. So for example, maybe we both like reading, right? I'm rich, so I buy maybe fancy books brand new. You might get the books from the public library or read them online, but we still can share this interest. We could still read the same books. We still could talk about them. We might be members of the same religious community where you and I, even though we have very different levels of wealth, go to the same church every week. And we have read the same religious texts, and we discuss that, and we come together and volunteer together. Maybe we play on the same sports team, etc. Right? You can list a ton of different hobbies and activities and interests, and these are all things that we could share even in a very unequal society. So it seems like inequality doesn't necessarily undermine community at all on this account, right? So it seems like the answer to the mechanism question isn't a very good one. Very unequal societies can still be ones where there's lots of community on this account. And at the same time, you could have very equal societies. You could have a socialist society where lots of redistribution happens. We live, we've got the same amount, say we all have the exact same amount of money, but we still have very different experiences and in fact have nothing in common, right? Because you say, go to church while I go to synagogue, or you play basketball while I play baseball, or you read some books, but I don't like to read books. I watch TV, etc., etc. Right. So the thought is that there are many ways that our experiences could still diverge. So it just seems like, given this, inequality just doesn't play that big of a role when it comes to shared experience, and therefore when it comes to community. We might have lots of community, we might have very little community, and very little of that effect has anything to do with our comparative levels of wealth. It just has to do with our shared interests or not shared interests. So that seems like a big problem with this account. This account isn't going to make community a very good reason for favoring socialism over capitalism. Additionally, and related to the point I was just making, it seems like this account of community, insofar as you think community is morally valuable, it's going to have very illiberal implications. So here's the idea, right? So suppose that you think it's very important, community is very morally important, right? It's morally important enough to justify having a socialist society rather than a capitalist society. Well, if that's the case, then it seems like community is also a reason to significantly limit any other kinds of differences in lifestyle that we might have, right? So if the idea is it's really important for us to have shared experience, to have common ground, well, think of all the things that I was just listing that could undermine our shared experience, that could undermine common ground. Different hobbies, different intellectual interests, reading different books, watching TV, attending different religious services. If all of these things can undermine our shared experience and our common ground, then it seems like if common ground is important, there's reason to actually restrict people's freedom to do these different things, to live the kinds of lives that they want to live. So the thought is that if you're at all liberally minded and you're attracted to the idea, you're a socialist and you think people should live very equal lives and should cooperate and, and workplaces should be run by the workers, etc. You might think all of those things, but insofar as you still think that people should then be able to spend their time how they want, rather than sort of mandatory shared endeavors, then this account of community is going to commit you to something you're not going to like very much. It's going to seemingly commit you to having to say, well, actually, people can't do those things. They have to have these shared experiences. That's another problem. The final problem that I'll list is it seems like this account doesn't actually do a good job of making sense of the cases of damaged community that I presented earlier in the talk. Right? So I want to say it gives bad diagnoses of these cases. So let's start with the commuter case, right? So in the commuter case, this account says, here's the problem. You're rich. Well, in this case, I guess I'm rich. You're poor. We live different lives. We have nothing to talk about as a result. But first, it seems like very often people can have very different experiences and still can talk to each other without any sort of problem, right? So typically when you meet people for the first time, one of the first questions, well, I don't know, maybe this doesn't translate across cultures, but in America, a very common first question when you meet somebody and you don't know what else to talk about is you say, oh, so what do you do for work? And then they tell you, and then they ask you, and you tell them, and you can have a very nice conversation with somebody. But about where the subject of that conversation is your very different experiences, right? You do different jobs, you live very different lives, and you tell each other about that, and you can have a nice bonding experience doing that. So it seems like you don't have to have shared experience to have nice conversations with people. So it seems like in this bus case, the problem can't be that, oh, these two people, the rich person and the poor person, have very different life experiences, so they just have nothing to talk about. We talk about our differences all the time. It seems like something else has gone wrong. And specifically, it seems like the problem isn't that they have nothing to talk about. It's that if they talk about certain things, then the situation could get very tense, right? So imagine that we're riding the bus together. I'm rich, you're poor, and I say, oh, this is terrible. This bus, it's so crowded, I'm uncomfortable, it smells bad. How can you do this all the time? This is so much worse than when I drive my car around. My car's so much better. It's got heated seats. It's got a really nice radio. It's way better than this. The thought is, well, if I said that, it seems like I'd be saying something pretty rude. Some sort of, you might imagine that other people on the bus, if they heard this, would be like, what are you talking about? Are you really complaining that you don't get to drive your fancy car around? Do you think, are we supposed to feel sorry for you that you just have to live like us? Right? It seems like what I've said is in fact just rude or gauche or however you want to describe it. Right? So it's not that we're unable to, it's not like you can't understand my complaints. It's just that my complaints seem really distasteful. So it seems like something else has gone wrong in this case. Right, so the common ground account gives the wrong interpretation of what's gone wrong here. Additionally, when you consider the other cases that I've presented, it seems like the common ground account can't explain what's gone wrong in those cases either. Right, so consider the fine-tuning case, right? Nick and Winston fighting over who owes who how much money. Here's a case of damaged community, but it doesn't seem like the problem here is a lack of common ground, a lack of shared experience. In fact, just the opposite, right? The whole case is premised on this fact that these two friends have done all these things together. They've had all these shared experiences. Yet nonetheless, it seems like this tension emerges. So it seems like the problem here isn't a lack of common ground. Something else has gone wrong. And then finally, in the no politics at the dinner table case, again, it seems like the people have a lot of common ground, right? They're family members. They have all these shared experiences. And in fact, they all have a shared interest in politics, arguably too strong of a shared interest in politics. They have a lot that they can talk about, a lot of shared experience to draw upon. but it seems like something else has gone wrong here, right? The issue is not, oh, we don't know how to talk to each other about politics. It's that once we start talking about politics, then things get very tense and we can't stop, and everyone ends up yelling at each other. Okay, so it seems like these three cases, something else has gone wrong, and the common ground account can't explain it. So given this, I think some other account of community is needed for socialists. And that's what I want to try to give. I want to try to give my own account that I think does a better job of answering the two questions I presented, the community question and the mechanism question, and a better job of explaining what's gone wrong in these cases. So I'll skip over those little subpoints. Okay, so I call my account the dispositional account. And here's the idea. According to me, a lack of community between people consists in their disposition to not aid each other or to harm each other. Okay, so let me clarify what this means. Okay, so when philosophers talk about dispositions, what they basically mean is to say something has a given disposition is to say that it tends to do a particular thing under the relevant circumstances. So for example, you might say that glass has a disposition to be fragile, to break. Why? Because there are many situations where glass will break where other things won't, right? It's a much more fragile disposition than metal. There are many cases where glass will break, where metal won't, when subjected to the same situation. Similarly, if you have a disposition to be funny, right, moving to talk about people, the thought is there will be many situations where you are able to make a joke and will in fact make a joke where somebody who's not funny would not, right? So the thought is that when talking about dispositions, the thought is, yeah, what will this person or this thing do in various circumstances? And in particular, in my account, what I'm interested in is how likely are people to help each other versus harm each other, right? When you consider a range of possible situations that people might be in, we might ask, yeah, would a given person help somebody in those situations? Would they, give them a gift? If somebody falls over, will they help them? If they need medical assistance, will they come to their aid? If they're cold, will they give them their coat, etc.? Versus in various situations, would a person, say, take another person's belongings or trip them or push them out of the way, etc.? And the thought is that different people will have different dispositions when it comes to these two tendencies, how likely they are to aid and how likely they are to harm each other. So then what I want to say is community, when answering the community question, what is community? Well, there's greater community among a group of people to the extent that the group have a stronger disposition to aid and a weaker disposition to harm one another, right? They're more likely to help each other. There's a greater range of circumstances where they will cooperate and try to benefit one another relative to other situations. Okay, so that's what I want to say community is. It's people's likeliness to help each other versus hurt each other. The second part of the question, of the community question, asks, well, what are the symptoms of a loss of community? What does a loss of community look like? And I answered this question by saying, a loss of community takes the form of various taboos that function to prevent the outbreak of conflict. Right? So the idea of a taboo is that there's just some things that everyone knows you're not supposed to talk about that. You shouldn't talk about it. It's not a law, but it's just, there's a norm in society where everyone says, oh yeah, we know you don't bring this up. And the thought is that the point of these taboos is to prevent conflict from breaking out. Because the thought is that in cases where community is damaged, right, when people lack community, they're more prone to harm each other. And so as a result, you need various taboos to keep people from doing that. Okay, so to clarify this, let's again go back to the cases that I presented. Right, so in the commuter case, right, imagine that we're riding the bus and I start complaining about how bad the bus is relative to my very comfortable life in my car and how much I like driving my car around. You can imagine somebody saying, oh, wow, I'm so sorry. Like, that's so terrible, right? Very sarcastically. And they say, why are you talking about this? We don't want to hear about your fancy car. To which, you can imagine me responding, oh, well, you don't have to be a jerk about it. they're saying, what do you mean? You're being the jerk. You're the one who's, running your mouth talking about this fancy car. And then I might say, oh, well, what, you don't like hearing about my car? Well, what are you going to do? And they say, oh, I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to make you be quiet, right? And then all of a sudden you've got people on the bus, they're standing up, they're, potentially even fighting each other, right? So very quickly, by just me talking about my fancy car, you can imagine how under the right circumstances, that could escalate into actual physical conflict very quickly. So it seems like in this case, everyone knows there's a taboo. I shouldn't talk about my fancy car. And why? Because if I start talking about how good my life is relative to yours, things might get ugly very quickly. There might be some conflict. And similarly, we see that in the other cases, right? In the no politics at the dinner table case, it seems like, it's made explicit that the taboo is formally articulated, and the thought is, we're not allowed to talk about this. Why? Because if we do, everyone might get really mad at each other and stop cooperating as a family, stop, giving each other birthday presents because everyone's so mad at each other. So that's, and similarly in the fine tuning case, again, you have these friends, everything's going great. All of a sudden, the subject of personal debts comes up, and their entire relationship deteriorates into this nasty conflict. And it seems like what's gone wrong here is that they breached a taboo. Among friends, usually you don't want to get really fine-grained about what it is that your friends owe each other, what your friends owe you and what you owe them, because this kind of conflict can break out. Okay, so that's how I answer the second community question. And then finally, there's the question of, well, what's valuable about community? And here I think the answer is somewhat more obvious, right? Why is community valuable? Well, if community is just how likely we are to help each other and promote each other's welfare, then the reason to promote community is to promote welfare, right? Our lives in a world where everyone has a lot more community, everyone's lives will go a lot better because everyone will be much more inclined to help each other and less inclined to harm each other. And that's going to lead to a better world. Almost everyone can agree about that. So it seems like community is at least instrumentally valuable. It's valuable because it promotes welfare, which everyone agrees is valuable. So if it turns out that capitalism undermines community, then that's a reason that there are important welfare-based reasons to reject capitalism. Additionally, I think that community tends to go hand in hand with just what might be called fellow feeling, where you just have a generally positive, friendly attitude toward the people you engage with. And I think there's something intrinsically morally valuable about that, right? So you just imagine, when you're walking down the street, you see a neighbor, you say, oh, hello, and they say hello, and everyone smiles at each other. You're having a nice time. That seems better than if you kind of walk past each other and glare at each other. So the thought is that there's just something intrinsically nice about people getting along and being friendly, and that goes along with community. Okay. So that's my answer to the community question. So what still has to be answered then is the mechanism question, right? So if this is what community is, why is it that capitalism undermines community, on my view? And to answer this question, I first want to give a very general account about when it is that people's community is undermined. And what I want to say is that community, I think, is undermined between people when their interests are what I call structurally opposed. Okay, so here's what I mean by this. I want to say two people's interests are structurally opposed when how well one fares is inversely correlated with how well the other one fares, right? So when things go well for you, it goes badly for me, and vice versa, right? When it goes well for me, then it goes badly for you. Here's an example. Among economists, they like to make test subjects play this game called the ultimatum game. And the way the game works is somebody gets an amount of money, say 100 New Zealand dollars, and then they get to decide how it will be split between them and another participant, right? So say you and I are playing, I get the $100, and I could now say split it 50-50, or I could give 70 to myself and 30 to you, 90-10, or 100-0, my choice. Then once I make my decision about how to split the money, you get to decide if either we both get the money that I've assigned us or neither of us gets the money, right? So say I gave myself $99 and you won, you might punish me and say, well, you know what? No, we get $0. We both get nothing, right? Or maybe you say, okay, well, I give myself 80 and I give you 20. And you say, well, I guess 20 is better than nothing, so I accept. And then we both get these payouts. Okay, so that's the ultimatum game. This game is notable because in the ultimatum game, it's not strictly zero sum, right? We both can benefit by playing the ultimatum game. In fact, almost always, both of us will benefit. So it's better for us to both play the game than not play the game. But nonetheless, there's still a sense in which our interests are structurally opposed when we play this game, right? Because the more money I get, the less money you get, and vice versa, right? So there's this, our interests are structurally opposed in this way. And what I want to argue is that when people's interests are opposed in this way, that's going to undermine community. Why? Well, because when our interests are opposed in this way, it actually becomes rational for us to struggle against each other and to try to sort of interfere with each other so that we can maximize our own share, right? So if I know that the better you do, that means I do worse, right? My welfare is negatively affected by your welfare being positively affected, then insofar as I'm rational and self-interested, it's rational for me to say, well, I need to make you do worse so that I do better. And you have the same sort of set of interests. Now, granted, we might not act on that, right? We might say, well, I'm going to refrain. But in the back of our minds, both of us will know that in this situation, in some sense, to let you do well comes at my expense and vice versa. So if I'm going to let you do well, if I have the opportunity to make things worse for you, but I decline, I'm hurting myself. And that's just something that I have to deal with. And I think that's tough. So I think that in certain situations, right, if a social environment is structured in such a way that our interests are opposed in this way, in some sense, it becomes rational for me to harm you and not to help you. Because the more that I help you, the more the more that sort of directly harms me. And I think this is evident in some of the cases of damaged community, right? So consider, just to pick the one that's sort of not economics related, consider the no politics at the dinner table case, right? Suppose that you and I are rival political views, right? You're a Marxist and I'm sort of a very right-wing person. Well, if we're both very politically active and engaged, we're actively working against each other, right? I'm using the money that I get, for example, to fund various right-wing causes that actively make the world worse as far as you're concerned. And I feel the same way about you. So now imagine that for my birthday, you give me a big cash present. Well, in some sense, you know that you're funding me funding right-wing causes. So when you help me, you're in some sense hurting yourself, and vice versa. So you might think it's just not rational for you to actually give me money in this case. I'm almost out of time, so I'll wrap up. But hopefully it's pretty clear, this sort of general idea of what structurally opposed interests are and why that might undermine community. Okay, so then what I want to say is that the reason that capitalism undermines community is because under capitalism, people's interests are structurally opposed. And they're structurally opposed for a few different reasons, right? So why, specifically, the market exchange that characterizes capitalism puts our interests at odds. So one way that it puts our interests at odds, one way that it pits us against each other, is that in market societies, there are scarce resources that people struggle over how to get as much as they can, right? So the thought is that there's only so much good stuff to go around. And so if you buy that stuff up, then there's less left for me. So my life goes worse and your life goes better. And vice versa, right? If I'm wealthy and have a lot of material possessions, those are in some sense all material possessions that other people can't have. And so as a result, what you end up with is you end up with a society where people are struggling to maximize their own shares, where that comes directly at the expense of other people's shares. So our interests are structurally opposed in this way. The better off I am, the worse off you are. And this makes it in some sense irrational for us to cooperate. Similarly, when you buy and sell things, when you're the buyer and I'm the seller, our interests are structurally opposed. And this one should be pretty obvious, right? Because we're struggling in some sense over the price, right? Imagine you're haggling with somebody, you're haggling with some salesperson or a vendor in a market, right? If you're trying to buy something, often you're trying to buy it for as low of a price as you can. while they're trying to sell it to you for as high of a price as they can. And in some sense, again, your interests are zero sum. They're trying to get as much out of you as they can, and you're trying to get as much out of them and give them as little as you can. So again, you're struggling against each other in a way that puts your interests at odds. And then finally, I want to say that sellers fare better at the expense of other sellers, and the same for buyers, right? So one of the core features of capitalist markets is that there's competition, right? If, say, you open up an ice cream shop, well, somebody else then might say, oh, look how much money you're making. I'm going to open my own ice cream shop. Now you have a competitor. Well, there's only so many buyers who want to buy ice cream, and it seems like the best way to make yourself profitable is for you to, undercut your seller to make better ice cream and sell it for a lower price. Ultimately, though, that's going to have the effect of running them out of business, right? There's a finite number of customers, and you're fighting over them. The more customers I get, the fewer you get, and vice versa. So again, it seems like our interests are structurally opposed. We're fighting for customers. And so then again, it's like, well, now say that after all of that, you find, I fall into the water and I'm drowning, and I'm like, help me, help me. In some sense, you still might be a good person and pull me out. But you know that if you pull me out, I might run you out of business the next day, and then your family is going to go hungry. So now you're almost put in this dilemma, right? Do you save me? Well, that might be the right thing to do, but you're directly hurting yourself. And you can understand then why people might not be inclined, why someone might say, oh, I didn't see anything, I didn't hear anything, and just walk by, right? Because they know that their options are save me or let me drown. And if they save me, that actually could lead to them going hungry. So in this way, right, my thought is the capitalist markets they create structural opposition between people's interests, thereby undermining community, increasing their tendency to harm each other, decreasing their tendency to help each other, and where this then takes the form of various taboos that inhibit conversation between people. Okay, thanks. That's my account. Thanks all for your patience. Hopefully that was pretty clear. But if it wasn't, feel free to ask any sort of clarifying questions in the chat. Like I said, I also have some people pre-submitted questions, so I can answer those. Well, I'll leave it up to the moderators, but I'd also be happy to maybe start by answering the questions of the people who are here if they put them in the chat. And then I can move to the pre-submitted questions. But I'm happy to do that in any order. So yeah, whatever you recommend.
Yes, thank you, Jesse, for the comprehensive and I think very coherent defense of your dispositional account. And since I think we have quite a few people here, and I think we can extend the meeting for like 15 to 20 minutes. Is that okay with you?
Yeah, that's fine with me.
Yes, I think we can proceed now with the pre-prepared questions, and I think you can present your answers to them now. I'm sure the participants are really interested in those. Yeah.
Okay, great. So yeah, so I'll start with the pre-prepared questions, and then if anybody else has other ones that they'd like to ask, please do enter them in the chat. Okay, so I'll just run through them in the order that they were submitted. I'll start by reading the question, and then I'll give my answer. Okay, so the first question is, how is community in capitalist society different from the concept of community in socialist societies, such as the Soviet Union or China? Is there any erosion of community in such societies, and why? All right, so this is a great question. And I'll start by saying, the way that I'm thinking about this is not that there's sort of different concepts of community in different in different societies and socialist societies versus capitalist societies. Rather, I want to say there's a single notion of community that applies across cultures, right? So it's the account that I gave. So I want to say, no matter where we are, the question for those of us who are concerned about community is, how disposed are people to help each other versus harm each other? And then it becomes an interesting question of, okay, yeah, are socialist societies, I sort of theorize that socialist societies will be better when it comes to community. There will be more community among their members and less among capitalist societies. But it does become something of an empirical question where we have to do some investigation and we have to see, well, is this in fact the case? This is all complicated by the fact that there are many different factors at play when it comes to comparing socialist societies such as the Soviet Union or China with capitalist societies. because there's lots of variation, say, between different socialist societies and different capitalist societies. American capitalism is very different from New Zealand capitalism in certain respects. But and there's also going to be very many sort of complicating factors, right? So one thing I'd say about the Soviet Union, for example, is that I would expect that in the Soviet Union, there is an important inhibitor of community that's been removed, right? So insofar as goods are just allocated to people and people aren't struggling with each other over goods, I would expect there to be more community in the Soviet Union. However, the Soviet Union also had a lot of other policies in place that might have equally undermined community at the same time. So, for example, the Soviet Union often rewarded people for informing on their neighbors, right? So if you thought that your neighbor was doing something that ran contrary to the project of socialism, or that maybe was just not adequately loyal to the Soviet Union, you could report them. And often, I believe, get some kind of reward for doing that. And that seems to be an example of people having structurally opposed interests, right? So it's a case where, oh yeah, I do better because I get a reward. If you do worse, you go to the gulag. So that's going to, I would argue, I would theorize that would have an effect of undermining community. So it's a little hard to say, right? So you have to, when you're actually looking at actual real world examples of socialist societies, there might not actually be more community in them because they might have various other policies in place that undermine community in just the same way that I think markets undermine community, right? So they're better maybe with respect to the markets aspect, but they might be worse in other respects. So that's, I think, what the kind of judgments you have to make when comparing socialist versus capitalist societies. And then I think as socialists, our ideal should be, well, we should try to maximize community by both getting rid of markets, while maybe not having other policies in place that would damage community in this way. Okay, so that's question one. Another question somebody had was they wanted to ask a little bit about Marx and religion, which is maybe a little bit of a different topic, but still maybe worth addressing. So they ask, does Marx hate religions and advocate passionately against religion? So what does Marx see exactly about religions? Are religions good under his eyes? Okay, so this is a big question, and it's maybe not a great question for me because I focus a little bit more on contemporary political philosophy and a little bit less on sort of Marx's scholarship himself, right? So I know enough to say, I know about Marx's sort of famous line that religion is the opium of the people, and I know that that's often there's sort of differing interpretations of what he means by this. Maybe he means, like, on the one hand, some people take him to be meaning that religion sort of deceives people and removes them from reality in just the same way that taking an opiate would. And I think there's something to that interpretation, but at the same time, there's an interpretation of, oh, well, opiates actually can play a useful role, right? If something's wrong with your body, if your body is damaged, opium can actually help you cope with that, right? It's sort of, in a way, the fact that you're taking opium is symptomatic that something has gone very wrong, and maybe it removes you from reality, but it does so in a way that actually sort of helps you and is understandable and reasonable given your circumstances. And I know there's interpreters of Marx who want to say, yeah, religion, there's an analogy there, right? So under capitalist society, people are immiserated, they're poor, they live very hard lives. Well, under such circumstances, religion might actually help with that. It might make you feel better. And so as a result, it might actually make the working class's life better. And maybe that's valuable. But while it's still being the case that maybe religion is sort of false in a certain respect, which I think is what Marx thought. So that's sort of the direct answer to the question. To try to connect it back to my talk, there's a question you might sort of ask, well, what does the relationship say between religion and community? Does religion tend to undermine community or promote community, right? If we're socialists and we think community is valuable for the reasons I've presented, then we can ask questions not just about whether or not markets and capitalism are good or bad with respect to community, but we can ask whether or not religion is good or bad with respect to community as well. And here I think the answer to this question might be mixed, right? So I think my talk gives us the tools to see how we would answer this question, because we would say, well, to answer this question, we'd have to ask, to what extent does religion make our interests structurally opposed? And it's going to depend upon the religion and how people interpret it, right? So here's an example where religion does not make our interests structurally opposed and actually might increase community, right? So suppose that I belong to a religion where I believe that all people are the children of God. They're all sacred, and it is my holy duty to make their lives better, right? There are many religious people. I know of many religious Christians and religious Jews who are like this and who think that they have a religious duty to improve people's lives. And if that's your view, then you're actually going to see your interests not as being opposed with other people's, right? The better they do, the better you do, because you're helping them, you're helping a child of God, for example, right? Your interests won't be opposed. And we would also then expect you to have a disposition to aid people. And in fact, that is what we see, right? There are many religious people who devote their lives to, say, helping the poor. Those people, there's a lot of community between those people in thanks to people's religious commitments. That's religion functioning well with respect to community. On the sort of alternatively, right, suppose that you see your religion says we have to save souls and all these other heathen religions are, they're sort of leading people astray and are going to lead people to hell. And so now you're struggling with other religious sects to try to save people's souls and, keep them from falling into heresy or worse. Now, all of a sudden, your relationship with a bunch of people is structurally opposed, right? The more people say that I convert to Catholicism, the fewer Protestants there are, or the fewer Muslims there are, or the fewer Hindus, which you might think is working directly against your interests. And then lots of conflict might erupt. And that's, for example, exactly what we see in, say, if you look in European history during the Protestant Reformation, when there were all these different Christian sects, and they were all, fought very violent wars against each other because their interests were structurally opposed. So I think religion can have different effects depending on how people interpret it. But I think that my account of community gives us a lens through which we can assess whether or not religions are going to, whether or not a given religion and a given person's approach to religion is going to be good or bad with respect to community. Okay, so that's that question. Another person asks, socialist presidential candidates such as Claudia Carina are rising in popularity among American Gen Z, yet the American society is culturally individualistic and foundationally capitalist. Is there a possibility for a socialist United States in the foreseeable future? So yeah, this is another good question. It's a little bit more speculative. It's also harder for me to answer. Like, I am from the United States originally. I have some sort of familiarity with the culture, but it's a hard empirical question. I would say I do think that there is some hope and reasons for optimism, right? As the question asker notes, the Generation Z, the sort of youngest cohort of adults, are have a much more negative view of capitalism than previous generations. And that's part of a trend. Each successive generation in the United States has been more friendly toward socialism and more hostile toward capitalism than the previous one. Each one has been more generally left-wing. And you might see that's part of a general trend across history. So in general, if you look across time spans of hundreds of years, people have been growing progressively more egalitarian and more liberal over time. And I think there's reason for optimism for thinking this trend will continue. There's actually a philosopher, he's a libertarian philosopher actually, but he has the view that over time, people's minds sort of will gravitate toward the correct moral view, which is why he thinks people have become less cruel on average over time and more liberal, is that people actually are sort of, people's minds, they're messy, they overshoot, but in general, given lots of time and argument and reasoning, people will converge on the correct moral view. So if we're correct and socialism is the best way to organize society, eventually people will figure that out. That's the hope. There's lots of questions about how this can happen in such an individualistic and capitalist society. I think that's one of the sort of questions that's being raised here. And I think that's an interesting question. Again, this is very speculative, but my view about this is that in some sense, there's actually some degree of dialectical movement happening, where when you grow up in a really hyper-capitalist society, you really see the harms and the negative effects that it has. In fact, for me, this paper, my concern with community emerges out of growing up. I went to a school that was fairly competitive. There was a lot of pressure in the school for people to do really well academically and to outcompete their peers so that they could get into better universities, because in the United States, getting into a very sort of elite university is the pathway to sort of getting a lot of money. And so, you sort of see this cascade where the capitalist marketplace cascades down into the university, which cascades down into sort of even, primary education. And as a result, there's lots of competition between people, and you could see the negative effects that it had on community. You could see just the same kinds of tension emerged as the various cases that I presented. And so I think that, people, you grow up in that and then you see this and you're like, this is just not a good way to live. There must be something better. So in a way, I think being exposed to this sort of hyper-capitalist environment can actually lead to this kind of dialectical movement where you then reject it in favor of socialist ideas. Yeah. Also, I think as an aside, it also helps that, Americans are getting steadily wealthier, for sort of, maybe familiar Marxist reasons, and also just for reasons of thinking that, if you are a generally wealthier society, people are a little bit less scared about their well-being and are a little bit more open to, say, adopting radical ideas and trying something new politically. Right. Well, if you're just scraping, trying to feed your family, it's much riskier to, try to maybe, say join a union, for example. Right. Union drives are risky. The employer will fight you. They might try to fire you. Right. It might close down your plant. If you live in a society where there's a lot more money sloshing around, you might feel a lot more comfortable to take risks. Anyway, so that's sort of my very off the cuff theorizing about that. Okay, so that's that. The next question is, can a community be created simply out of social interaction, regardless of social economic environment? And I think this is another good question. And I think I'll say two things. So the first thing I'd say is, how inclined you are to help somebody is ultimately going to depend on your own beliefs and attitudes. So even in, say, a hyper-capitalist society, I think you could have relationships that have, you could have lots of community between you and other people. Right. So say you're a committed socialist, right? You live in a hyper-capitalist society, but you might just say, I'm committed to sort of making sure that everyone has their fair share. I'm giving away my money to people. I'm volunteering at food banks. I'm, showing up to all the socialist meetings and, participating in their electoral wings or, their mutual aid wings, whatever is going on. And, doing all this, it comes at my expense because I live under capitalism. Like, I'm hurting myself when I do this. My life goes worse, but I just think it's the right thing to do. I think that's, in a way, a very appropriate attitude for a socialist to have. And it's one that would enable you to have community with other people, even under capitalism. But, in some sense, the point of my paper is that it's very difficult to sustain that attitude, right? You really have to be something of a moral fanatic, right? You have to be committed to lowering your own well-being for the sake of creating community, which I think people should do, but I also recognize it's a big ask, right? That's a big thing to ask of somebody. And so I think it's better to have social societies, an economic system that's set up that doesn't make it so costly to promote community, where community is naturally promoted and not undermined because the sort of society structures our economic relationships in a way that promotes community rather than undermines it. So we aren't having to constantly fight against our economic institutions to sustain these attitudes, right? So yeah, community, you can manifest it yourself. It doesn't have to come from any kind of broad social and economic change, but a broad social and economic sort of restructuring would help a lot. Okay, just a couple more questions. Sorry, I'm answering these in sort of a long-winded way. I'll try to be a little bit quicker. Okay, next question. Since capitalist societies undermine the concept of community, how can we fix the problem in a plausible way? So this sort of, I think, follows up on the last question, and I'd say, so maybe I can answer it quickly. What I'd say is, I think that, one thing that you can do is you can just try to expand this realm of human interactions that are not, where interests are not structurally opposed, right? The more you can remove competition from human interactions, the more you can remove situations where people are struggling against each other, the more that you can provide for people's needs unconditionally, not because you're trying to get something out of them, but rather because you're just trying to take care of them for their own sake. And the more people do that, the more community that you'll generate. So just sort of, yeah, but just directly. And at the same time, yeah, so that can happen both outside of the bounds of the state, with respect to individuals, but you also can sort of use the state as well, right? So when the state gives people welfare provision, I think that is sort of a way of creating social relationships that are unconditional, that are not competitive, and where interests aren't structurally opposed. And I think once you do that, you actually can create something of a virtuous cycle where once people find that their needs are being taken care of unconditionally by other people who are just promoting their interests, then all of a sudden, if you know that people are going to take care of you, then that makes you realize you don't have to constantly be struggling against other people to make sure you get what you need, right? If you know your needs are taken care of, then that enables you to start actually helping other people without expecting anything in return. And then you get this cascading effect, a domino effect, right? So I think that's, one of the best things that we can do as socialists is both direct mutual aid to people and pushing to expand the welfare state. Okay, so that's that question. Another question is, what intersections do you see between the concept of community and solidarity? If there are intersections, does capitalism undermine community in the same way it does solidarity? Another great question. I think the answer is going to depend a little bit on what you think solidarity involves, right? So I've given an account of community, but just in the same way that I've given, there are different accounts of community, there are different accounts of solidarity, and different philosophers think different things. So very generally speaking, I usually think of solidarity as being something a bit stronger than community, in the sense that if there's solidarity between you and I, there's also community, but we might have community, but not necessarily solidarity. And I think it's because I usually think of solidarity, and I think other philosophers typically think of solidarity as being more connected to struggle, right? So as I've characterized community, right? Community is just helping, is just a tendency to help people and promote their interests. Not necessarily, like that can take the form of helping them struggle against oppressive structures, but not necessarily, right? There might be no oppression whatsoever, but we still just sort of go about each other, our days helping each other. And there's be community then between us, but not solidarity. By contrast, right, if you have, say, solidarity with the Palestinian struggle, right, you might think, oh, well, we're trying to support the Palestinians in their efforts. Or if you have solidarity with the queer community, you're trying to support them, sort of resisting homophobia or transphobia or what have you. Or alternatively, some people think of solidarity as actually solidarity among people who are actively working together, right? So it's not sort of some people from without helping a different group, right? It's all members of groups. So say solidarity among workers, right? You might think, yeah, when workers have solidarity, they're working together to say fight back against the boss. They're on strike. They're drawing upon solidarity to do that. That's, I think, an even stronger relationship. It's not they both are helping each other. They're inclined to promote each other's interests in a way that implies that there is community between them, but they're also doing something else. They're engaged in this kind of joint project, right? So I think solidarity is a bit of a stronger notion. The two go hand in hand. They're nicely complementary, but you need a little bit more to have solidarity. Okay, sort of two more. How am I doing on time? Do I have time to answer a couple of additional questions?
Yes, you're free to answer how many questions you like. Yeah.
Oh, okay, great. There's two more, so I'll just try to answer them quickly. Okay, so another question is Silvia Federici, and more recently Nancy Fraser, famously argued that capitalism inherently and systematically devalues care work. Is this the result of capitalism's undermining the concept of community, given that care is also a major component of your account of community? Great, yeah, it's a great question, and I think the answer to this is definitely yes. This is a nice, I think, example of another way that capitalism undermines community that I don't really talk about in the paper. So I think care work, as I've defined community, care work would be a great example, right? If there's more community between people to the extent that they're inclined to help each other and assist each other, that's what care workers do. They take care of those in need, people who can't help themselves and don't have anything, to offer, the capitalist market. People like parents, or people caring for their parents, or people caring for their friends, etc. And right, these various critics, especially feminist critics, of capitalism have argued that capitalism tends to devalue these forms of caring, tends to sort of push people into the marketplace, into selling their labor rather than spending their time caring for other people. And that's a nice example of how community would be displaced, right? You go from having a relationship where you're just helping people unconditionally to moving to relationships where you're struggling against other people for income. And, then the person coming into care, who displaces your care work, right? Rather than maybe caring for your own children, you put them into daycare. Daycare can be a totally valuable and useful thing, but you also are in a situation where there's maybe a little bit less community, right? If you don't pay your daycare, if the daycare workers want more money and you can't afford to give it to them, they're not going to watch your kid. They don't really care about your kid. They're not inclined to help your kid in those circumstances, even if it's very important, right? Because your interests have sort of become opposed in this way. Okay. And then the final question is a long one. Under capitalism, as socialists, do we need to talk and act specifically about and in relation to the community where our primary constituents are, which is to say the working class communities around the world? And if so, does this also suggest needing to imagine the working class community as composed of many differences too, differences which also compose communities within the working class, like the queer community, women's community, and so on? In other words, do those communities within the working class community require recognition for concrete community bonds to form within the working class? Or is practicing community as a socialist value in general sufficient in itself for constituting an effective anti-oppressive class politics? So there's a lot here in this question. I think one thing that maybe needs to be parsed apart here is community from solidarity, right? So that was brought up in my answer to the previous question, because I think there's differing questions here. Because we might think that, I think this question might pertain a little bit more to people who theorize about solidarity, right? So when it comes to community and just trying to promote bonds between people, promote people's dispositions to help one another and not harm one another, to make sure their interests aren't opposed, you can often do that, I think, without necessarily attending to group differences and taking note of group differences. Sometimes that might be important, right? If it turns out that there, say, is a degree of structurally opposed interests in virtue of group difference, right? So suppose you live in a society where some people benefit from racial privileges and others, do not, right? Then you might think that actually our interests are zero-sum, right? You might think that, for example, in the United States, white people in some sense benefit from the oppression of Black people, or men benefit from the subordination of women. And in that case, we might have sort of these distinctive reasons to attend to identity-based forms of oppression, insofar as we see those forms of oppression as rendering people's interests zero-sum, or rendering their interests structurally opposed. Right? It might be hard for there to be community between men and women in a patriarchal society. I think that's very plausible. So in that sense, attending to those kinds of group differences will make a difference, and might be very relevant with respect to community. But then there's sort of the separate question of, when we're concerned with solidarity, what should we do when thinking about these group differences? Because there, as I'm sure many of you have encountered, there is often a debate among the left over to what extent should we pay attention to and emphasize these sort of various identity groupings within the working class. And you have some people who say, oh, we should just focus on workers as workers, and focusing on these identities sort of actually divides us and has this anti-solidaristic effect, right? It undermines solidarity. And other people say, no, actually, we need to have solidarity with these groups. And I think that's a harder question. I usually am inclined toward thinking that, we need to do both, and we need to pay attention to the many different forms of oppression that people face. And that's sort of a key component of showing solidarity. But that's a little bit outside of my sort of area of research, so I don't have as much to say about that. Okay, I think that answers all of the questions that I've been given. Yeah, I don't know if people have other questions that they want to ask in the chat, just if they want things that could be clearer or anything else. Yeah.
Yes, I think one other member is currently typing their question in the Q&A box. So in the meantime, I would just like to thank you, Jesse, for attending this meeting. I think your contributions are very much valuable, because I think your dispositional account of community, I think it accords very well with what like theorists about identity politics versus say the structural nature of markets have said about class reductionism. I think Vivek Chibber has also said a lot about that. And Lillian Chicheria, I think she also wrote an article about how class matters. And I think the dispositional account that you said, it really accords very, I think it's a really good explanation of the dynamics inside the workplaces in general. And it also explains the dynamics between workers in general, because as you said, workers are being pitted against each other. They are competing for higher wages, for promotions. And then therefore, as Vivek Chibber argued, I think famously argued, capitalist systems systematically undermine solidarity, and that explains why like 21st century campaigns against capitalism have mostly failed, because it's very difficult to form solidarity links when you're like systematically pitted against each other. So I think your contribution is very much valuable. And then we have another question from Cuốn. Do you think socialism is established mainly through policy, or rather through grassroots movements in today's free market society?
Yeah, it's great. So yeah, this is another good question. I think, I mean, ideally, I think that both mechanisms are sort of important. I think in my view, the right way to think about socialism is not necessarily as an all or nothing thing, right? So in some sense, I think it's something of a mistake to think of, oh, this country is a socialist country and this one is not. Instead, I think we should think of any given society as having a mix of socialist practices and capitalist practices, right? So insofar as goods are allocated to people, say, in accordance with need, right? When goods are just given to those who need them most, right? I think that's a socialist practice. And that can be done either via the state or via private individuals, right? So you might have the state give out welfare payments directly to people. And in that case, it's meeting their needs. It's allocating resources. Well, in this case, it's still using money, but right, you can imagine state direct provision of housing or medical care. And in those cases, it's providing important goods and services directly to people on the basis of need. And that would make, those would be a sort of a socialist part of society. And then insofar as goods are allocated via exchange, specifically conditional exchange, where people buy and sell things from each other, right? Then those would be capitalist parts of society. And I think that if you're a socialist and you think that there's something bad about capitalism, whether that be that capitalism generates significant inequality or that it undermines community between people, then you have reason to want to try to expand the part of society that operates in a socialist fashion as much as possible. And I think, again, that can take many forms. It could be done through the state, through things like, welfare payments, or it could be done privately, right? You don't need the state to make welfare transfers. If you manage to accumulate a significant amount of money, you can be your own welfare state, and you can give money directly to people. I'm sort of focusing on the egalitarian aspects when it comes to, say, worker controls of companies, right? You might say you think that that's an important aspect of socialism. Then the thought would be the state can do that by mandating, for example, worker ownership of various companies, or that you can sort of do it yourself because you create a company and then you set it up such that it is a worker-owned cooperative. I think both are valuable approaches, and which you focus your efforts on is going to have to be a judgment that you make based on your local context and what you think is going to be most viable. And I mean, you can obviously advocate for both. I tend to be a little bit more of a pessimist about the potential for significantly expanding socialism at the state level. I think there's definitely major movement that can be done in terms of giving people more welfare payments, particularly in the United States and a lot of other sort of developed countries that have a lot of money to give around to people. But at the same time, trying to get rid of markets, for example, is going to be something very challenging to do at a state level without running into some of the problems that affected the Soviet Union. And so as a result, I think if you don't like markets and you think markets are distasteful in a given way, but maybe you don't have a clear vision about how to replace them on a society-wide scale, then probably the best thing to do is to be like, to what extent can we expand just at the grassroots level from the bottom up? To what extent can we expand our socialist practices, right? So maybe we don't get rid of we can't get rid of all market exchange. That could be really potentially disastrous if we don't have a really good alternative lined up. But what we can do is we can open, you can do free food giveaways to the people most in need. You can, and there's often a practice here that in New Zealand, some anarchists run a very free store, or what do they call it? A really free store, where basically people just donate items and then they arrange them, and then you can come and you just take whatever you need. Or there are restaurants that run on a pay whatever you want model, pay what you can. So you come and you order the food, and if you can afford to pay for the costs, you do. If you can't, then you don't, and they just give you the food for free. All these practices, I think, are ones that socialists can engage in, even if there's maybe not a lot of hope for, say, state-level reform. But yeah, how you invest your energies, I think, just depends upon what you think the prospects are for state-level reform versus low-level bottom-up change.
Yes, thank you very much, Jesse. And I think what you said earlier accords very much with what I think Eric Olin writes, advocates about, like, eroding capitalism. You build mini structures in capitalism, and then
yes, exactly. I think his interstitial strategies, I think, is a very appealing concept and very promising.
Yes, thank you, thank you. Okay, so I don't think we have any other questions, but I do encourage listeners, if they have any other questions, you can send them to our group, and I will forward them to Jesse so that he can possibly answer them. Okay, thank you, Jesse, for your time.
Yeah, I'd be happy to answer anybody's question. Sorry, I'd be happy to answer anybody's questions. And yeah, you can also go to my website, jessespafford.com, where you can read any of my papers, and my email address is there as well if you want to get in touch with me. So yeah, happy to answer any follow-up questions that people have.
Fantastic. Thank you, Jesse. Và xin cảm ơn tất cả mọi người vì đã tham gia buổi họp ngày hôm nay. Và buổi họp ngày hôm nay thì sẽ được đăng lên trên YouTube vào khoảng tầm thứ Năm và thứ Tư hoặc thứ Năm. Và phần tóm tắt của buổi họp ngày hôm nay thì cũng sẽ được đăng vào lúc đó. Và mình sẽ dịch tất cả nội dung của buổi họp sang tiếng Việt. Cảm ơn tất cả mọi người vì đã tham gia. Buổi họp đến đây là kết thúc. So thank you, Jesse, and we hope to see you again, or we hope to hear back from you again in another collaboration. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Sorry, can I have another question?
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to answer one more.
Yeah, me. Can I have another question? My history teacher said me that when Lenin published NEP, he learned it from from capitalism. By contrast, when Truman published New Deal, he also learned from socialism. Is that right?
I'm not sure. That's a little bit outside of my, I'm not much of a history person, so I unfortunately don't think I can answer this. I focus a little bit more on the philosophy of socialism and know a little bit less about its history. So the answer is I don't know. I'm sorry, I can't be more helpful.
Oh, thank you so much.
Like I said, if anyone has other questions, feel free to email me. Hopefully I'll be more helpful when it comes to those.
Thank you, Jesse. I'll try to remind our viewers of that and remind our group of that. Thank you very much. And this concludes our meeting. Thank you.